it was clear to me that there was something about the West that I didn't really understand, because the entire story that I had heard my whole life was that the United States was the big protector of Israel. But if the United States is forcing the organization created by the exterminator of the European Jews onto the Jewish state, when the Jewish state was created to protect the Jewish people from Nazi genocides, then what was the United States doing introducing this organization created by the Nazi killer of the Jews into the Jewish state? That obviously meant to me that I didn't understand the world. So I started researching the entire history of U.S. foreign policy towards the Jewish people and towards the Jewish state. And what I found when I started looking at this information without the filter of the mainstream media and mainstream academia was that U.S. foreign policy towards Israel had been anything but favorable. The United States foreign policy, in my conclusion, after doing all this research, it has been designed to undermine the security of the Jewish state. And lately, this has become very obvious to people who are paying attention to the behavior of U.S. bosses in the wake of October 7th. But before that, it was a lot harder to notice because of the barrage of mainstream media and established academia. The entire thrust of U.S. diplomacy towards Israel since October 7th has been geared towards stopping Israel from achieving a real victory over its enemies. And not only that, we know that shortly before the Hamas attack of October 7th, the U.S. released billions of dollars for Iran. And after the Israeli operation in Gaza began, they sent $100 million to Hamas. But it's even worse than that, because we know that the U.S. bosses are very intimately allied with Qatar. They have their most important military base in the Middle East in Qatar. Qatar cannot exist without U.S. protection. I mean, Qatar is a tiny little peninsula, completely flat, entirely made of sand, with the biggest gas reserves in the world. So obviously it is a prize for anybody who wants to conquer Qatar, which means that Qatar cannot exist without U.S. military protection, which in turn means that the U.S. has total control over Qatari foreign policy. And what is Qatari foreign policy? It is to support and fund the psychopathic terrorists of Hamas who are entirely oriented publicly towards the genocidal destruction of the Jewish state. In order to understand what they want, you have to do a little history to know what their ideology is. For me, a very important book to understand all this has been Edwin Black's War Against the Weak, Eugenics and America's Campaign to Create a Master Race. That book is a watershed, because what Edwin Black documented was that the people running the United States were also the people running the international eugenics movement in the first half of the 20th century. The eugenics movement is the parent movement that produced German Nazism. Eugenics is the original ideology of the alleged biological superiority of the Germanic stock. That's what eugenics is. And they were always interested in destroying modern democracy, because the eugenics argument is that people in the lower classes don't have enough Germanic blood, and therefore they are mentally retarded. This is what they claim. The German Nazis are the evolution of German eugenics. German eugenics was funded and led from the United States. And this is something that most people don't know about anymore, because the history of eugenics has also been suppressed. The most important leaders and financiers of the eugenics movement, people like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, Thomas Watson, the guy who was running IBM, these people were sending a lot of money to Germany, helping create the German eugenics movement that became German Nazism. This was all coming from the U.S. power elite. So once you understand that the people running the United States are eugenicists who were very fond of the German Nazis and helped the German Nazis get set up, once you know that, you can begin to understand the post-war foreign policy of the United States, because nobody removed the eugenicists from power in the United States.
Wow. I mean, the names Ford and Rockefeller and so on resonate very strongly with all kinds of conspiracy theories which are probably not theories. This is all extremely disturbing. And we hear very, very little of this. There doesn't seem to be any public interest or any interest, I wouldn't say public, but journalistic interest in uncovering any of this. Does journalism even still exist?
The eugenicists took over the entire media and academic establishment a very long time ago. This began in the late 19th century when people like John D. Rockefeller Sr. and other great industrialists began taking over the big media and also established academia. So Rockefeller, together with Carnegie, created something called the General Board of Education. And with their donations, they started taking over the university system. If you look at the grants for research in the United States from the early 20th century to the present, you'll see that the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, the Ford Foundation have been the main sources of money for scientific research. And by doing that, they've basically taken over the university establishment. They've also taken over the big media. One thing that's very important to understand is that the American eugenicists, in particular the Rockefellers, were completely, very heavily involved in the creation of U.S. intelligence. The main U.S. intelligence infrastructure was created in 1947 with the National Security Act. When they did that, they incorporated the people that Rockefeller had been putting together to study psychological warfare in the 1930s. So the Rockefellers had an entire scientific project to study how to use the mass media to manipulate democratic citizens. That was going on in the 30s. Those researchers became the psychological warfare experts of the United States during World War II. And after World War II, they became the professors of communications research in high prestige universities and these professors were being funded by the CIA clandestinely so that they would create these communications departments that train absolutely everybody that works in the media, in the modern media system. So through the intelligence services, the eugenicists acquired control of the entire media space that, quote unquote, informs people about what's supposedly going on.